The brass was still cold when they found it. 18 spent casings .338, Lapua Magnum arranged in a rough line across a frost-covered rooftop 6 stories above a street that no American was supposed to be on. The sun had barely cleared the tree line over FOB Lincoln, Virginia, and the investigator who climbed those stairs on Christmas morning was only looking for a missing rifle. He found something else entirely. He counted the casings twice. Then he pulled out his radio and stood very still in the December cold, looking down at the street below where the last traces of the previous night's violence were still visible in the rubble and the blood and the silence that follows when fighting is finally finished. 17 enemy fighters dead, 1 engagement, 1 position, 1 shooter. No name on any deployment log. No mission authorization on any board. Nothing in the operational record that put a friendly asset on this rooftop at 23:59 hours on December 24, 2014. Nothing except the rifle itself, which had been left in its case, neatly latched beside the last brass casing like a calling card from someone who had never intended to hide what they had done. The investigator photographed the serial number and ran it through the system. The weapon had been issued to Staff Sergeant First Class David Harlow, 75th Ranger Regiment, United States Army. Killed in action, Kunar Province, Afghanistan, October 3, 2007. He read that 3 times. Then he looked at the secondary field. Next of kin, beneficiary of service record, current holder of the weapon after estate transfer. Specialist Kate Harlow, FOB Lincoln, currently confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings, January 15, 2015. The investigator stood there for a long moment in the cold Virginia air, and he did not call it in immediately. He stood there, and he thought about what 18 brass casings meant and what they had cost the woman who left them behind. Her left hand was wrapped in surgical gauze from the wrist to the fingertips when they brought her in for the first interview that morning. The frostbite had done its work quietly during the night. 2 knuckles of the middle finger, the top joint of the ring finger. Gone by the time the surgeon finished the assessment. She sat straight in the chair. She answered every question with the same even flat voice. She did not explain herself. She did not apologize. She looked like someone who had already made peace with every consequence and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. To understand what Kate Harlow did on that rooftop, you have to understand who David Harlow was. And to understand David Harlow, you have to understand a specific morning in October 2007 in a valley in Kunar Province where the mountains come down hard and fast on both sides and the wind carries the cold from peaks that never lose their snow. His patrol had taken contact from 3 directions simultaneously. 7 Rangers a route that had been marked clear 48 hours earlier, and an enemy force that had been patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment. That kind of patience is its own form of violence. It tells you the men you are fighting have done this before and intend to do it again. David Harlow put himself between the ambush and his 6 remaining men, and he did not move from that position until all 6 of them were out. The citation used words like extraordinary valor and selfless sacrifice, the formal language that military documents reach for when plain language feels inadequate. What it described in technical terms was a man who stood in the open and drew fire so that other men could run. He did not survive the engagement. Kate was 21 years old when the notification officers knocked on the door of the house in Roanoke, where she and her mother had lived since she was 9. She stood on the front porch and received the news the way soldiers' families receive it, which is to say standing up, and did not allow herself to fall apart until the officers had gone and the door was closed, and her mother had made it as far as the kitchen table before her legs stopped working. The MK-21 precision rifle came to her through the estate. David Harlow had carried it for 6 years. It still had his range tape on the stock marked in his handwriting. Windage corrections for distances he had calculated himself in a hand that was steady even on paper, even when he knew what his job required him to do. Kate kept the tape. She was already 3 months into her enlistment application when the rifle arrived. She had started the process before the funeral, before the notification, before she had any reason to believe she would need a reason beyond the one she had carried since she was old enough to understand her father's work. She had grown up watching him prepare, and she had understood since she was a child that preparation was its own form of love. He had taught her to shoot on a range in the Blue Ridge foothills when she was 14, a .22 to start then, progressively heavier calibers, as her frame developed the discipline to manage them. He was not a man who pushed his children toward danger. He was a man who believed that knowing what you were capable of was the only honest relationship you could have with the world. She enlisted 7 months after the funeral. She arrived at advanced training with MK-21 already broken into her grip. Her instructors noticed this almost immediately. There is a difference between someone learning to shoot in someone refining what they already know, and Kate Harlow moved through the qualification stages with the efficiency of someone who had been doing the work long before the Army formalized it. At the end of her advanced marksmanship course, the range master, a warrant officer with 22 years of service who had trained 2 generations of snipers, told her that her shot groups at 700 meters were the tightest he had personally recorded in a decade of instruction. He asked her how long she had been shooting. She said, "Since I was 14. He nodded and wrote something in his notebook and did not ask anything else because men who have spent their lives around firearms recognize instinctively that some things are not about talent. They are about repetition in the dark before anyone is watching, before there is anything to prove. They are about a daughter alone on a range at 6 in the morning putting rounds through a rifle that used to belong to her father, not because she was trying to be him, but because it was the only conversation they had left." Before he deployed for the last time, David Harlow had sat with Kate on the porch of the Roanoke house on a September evening with the leaves just beginning to turn. He told her 2 things. The first was that the MK-21 was hers when he was gone, and that it was a tool, and tools existed to do work that mattered, and she should use it only when there was no other choice she could live with. The second thing he said was that he had asked everything of this family for a long time, and he was asking one more thing, and that was for her to come home safe every time. Not victorious, not decorated, safe. She gave him her word on both counts. Her mother, Margaret, had extracted a similar promise years before in different words, in the blunt and practical language of a woman who had spent 18 years waiting for a knock on the door she hoped would never come. Margaret called every Sunday. The conversation was always short. The important information was always the same. "You are still there, yes. You are still whole. Yes, you will come back. Yes." Kate had been keeping both promises without significant difficulty for nearly 7 years. Then came October 2014, in the hill country outside a forward operating base in a province that will not be named in any public record, and 4 Marines in a drainage ditch with their ammunition almost gone, and an enemy force that had stopped advancing because they did not need to advance anymore, because the Marines had nowhere to go. Kate was in overwatch position 400 meters east with explicit orders to observe only. Command was running a negotiation through back channels with local intermediaries. The standing instruction was clear. Do not escalate. Maintain position. Wait for resolution. She waited for 47 minutes. In those 47 minutes, she watched the enemy use the negotiation as cover. She watched them move a crew-served weapon to a new position that covered the only viable extraction route. She watched them do this slowly and carefully and without any urgency because they were not worried about the negotiation. They were waiting for it to provide the window they needed. At the 48th minute, she stopped waiting. 7 shots. The weapon that had moved into position did not fire. The 4 Marines moved when the fire broke and they made it out, and the negotiation collapsed immediately because there was nothing left to negotiate around. The investigation was opened before she was back at base. The officer who conducted it, a colonel named Harlan Owens, was meticulous and thorough, and spoke to her with the careful neutrality of a man who had already written his conclusion and was collecting supporting documentation. The 4 Marines submitted testimony. Their statements described in specific and technical detail what they believed had saved their lives and why. Owens read each statement, thanked them for their time, and continued building his case. Kate's record showed nearly 7 years of service, with commendations at every level, marksmanship qualifications that were frankly exceptional, and a consistent pattern of mission completion without incident. None of that was in dispute. What was in dispute was simpler and harder to argue against. She had received a direct order, and she had chosen not to follow it. The court-martial was scheduled for January 15, 2015. She spent the weeks before Christmas in confined quarters at FOB Lincoln. Her access credentials revoked her weapon technically under lock in the armory. The MK-21 had been transferred to her through estate channels and existed in a gray area of the property registry that the administrative staff had not yet resolved. This was a bureaucratic oversight. It was also the reason she still had it. Her credentials had not been fully revoked either. There was a clearance code attached to her intelligence access account that should have been zeroed out when her status changed. Someone had not completed the paperwork. In a large installation with an administrative staff working reduced hours in the week before Christmas, this kind of thing happened more than anyone cared to admit. On the evening of December 23, 2014, Kate used that credential to pull the operational planning file for a mission designated Alpha 7 Sweep Eastern District, 2,200 hours, December 24th. She read it twice. The intelligence package was clean, almost perfectly clean. Weapons cache moderate value, Residential block estimated resistance, minimal to none. Route in, route out, checkpoint designations, satellite imagery with key structures marked in precise detail. The kind of package that came together when someone had spent real time on it, when the source material was reliable, when the picture was complete. That was what was wrong with it. In Kate's experience, complete pictures came from good intelligence. But good intelligence in a residential area with active presence did not look like this. It did not cover every approach angle with this level of detail. It did not account for every structural weak point in the surrounding buildings. It did not provide this quality of imagery of the specific interior spaces where a defending force would need to position itself to most effectively engage a 12-man patrol moving in standard tactical formation. This was not good intelligence. This was a map drawn by someone who knew exactly where the patrol would be and when, and had prepared accordingly. She sat with that assessment for a long time in the quiet of her quarters, with the MK-21 on the bed beside her and the operational file on her laptop screen. Then she checked the satellite imagery against her own mental map of the approach routes, the building lines, the elevation changes, the dead ground. 6 stories up, northeast corner of the residential block, 640 meters to the approach route. Clear sight lines across 7 city blocks, minimal exposure from ground level. She knew the position before she had consciously decided anything. She had known it the way she knew all positions as a geometry problem with a human solution, the kind of calculation her father had spent years teaching her to make before she was old enough to understand why. At 1900 hours on December 24th, 2014, Kate Harlow signed out of her quarters through a perimeter checkpoint using an old transit authorization that had not been flagged in the access system. She carried the MK-21 in its case, her standard cold weather gear, and 18 rounds of .338 Lapua Magnum that she had kept in a personal storage box since her last training cycle. She was on the rooftop of the 6-story building at 1923 hours. She would be there for the next 4 hours and 47 minutes in temperatures that would drop to 11 degrees Fahrenheit by midnight. Her phone buzzed in her chest pocket at 1940, her mother calling. Sunday had come and gone, and Margaret Harlow called on Sundays, and then sometimes she called again when she had not heard back. Kate looked at the screen for a moment, at her mother's name, at the contact photo she had set years ago, her mother standing in the garden in Roanoke with her hands covered in dirt and an expression of complete satisfaction on her face. She put the phone away and settled her eye to the scope. At 2200 hours, Alpha 7 moved out from FOB Lincoln. Garrett Mercer had been running missions of this kind for 2 decades. He had the particular stillness of men who have been under fire enough times to stop confusing stillness with safety. He moved his 12 men through the pre-mission checks with the efficiency of someone who had done the procedure so many times it had ceased to require conscious attention, which freed his attention for the things that actually needed it. What needed his attention tonight was a feeling he could not quantify. He had felt it before, not often. Twice, maybe 3 times in 20 years, in the hours before missions that had gone sideways in ways no briefing had predicted. The feeling did not have a name. It was not fear exactly. It was more like the body's understanding of something the mind had not yet processed, a low-frequency signal that the back of the brain runs independently of the reasoning centers. Something is wrong with this picture. He shared it with no one. You did not share that kind of instinct with 12 men who needed to move with confidence into a situation they were about to enter, regardless. You filed it. You stayed alert. Preston Dalton, his lieutenant, did not have this feeling. Dalton was a methodical, precise man who had read the intelligence package 3 times. He had run the route analysis twice. He had identified no substantive gaps in the picture. Intel's been verified at 3 levels, he told Mercer during the final brief. This is a clean op. Mercer nodded. He did not argue. He told his men to move. Warren Tate, the team's communications specialist, said nothing during the brief. He rarely did. Tate had a quality that some people mistook for disengagement, a habit of watching situations from a slight remove, as though he were always standing 1 step outside whatever was happening and tracking it from that angle. He had been doing this long enough that his instincts had a nearly perfect record. He watched the mission brief. He watched Mercer's face. He checked his equipment with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He did not share his thoughts either. At 22:47 hours, Alpha 7 reached the outer perimeter of the Eastern District objective. Mercer raised his thermal scope and began his assessment. The intelligence had estimated minimal resistance, no more than 7 signatures if there was any presence at all. He counted 12, then 20. Then the count passed 30 and became unreliable because the signatures were distributed through the surrounding structures in a pattern that was not consistent with a chance defensive position. It was consistent with preparation, with planning, with someone who had drawn a map of exactly where 12 Americans would be standing and had placed his forces accordingly. He keyed his radio, identified himself, gave the count, requested clarification. He got static, then a voice asking him to stand by. He did not have long to wait for the ambush to declare itself. Explosions from 3 directions at once, not triggered by the patrol's movement, but by a signal, a coordinated initiation that meant a single command had activated multiple positions simultaneously. The building to their left came apart in a directed collapse that sealed the primary extraction route. RPG fire from the elevated positions on the north side of the block turned the street into a channeled kill zone. Mercer's men moved the way they had trained to move, which was fast and without hesitation, finding cover in the ruins of what had been a market storefront, maintaining fire discipline, keeping their sectors. Clifford Brooks took a fragment hit across the shoulder and kept moving without breaking stride, the way men with 3 children at home and 18 years of experience tend to keep moving when the alternative is worse. He had shown Mercer a photograph before they left base that evening. 3 kids in matching Christmas pajamas, the youngest, barely old enough to sit upright on her own. He carried that photograph in his left brace pocket, now behind his body armor, next to the plates. Brennan Cole, 23 years old, dove behind a concrete barrier and came up already returning fire. He had taped a photograph of his fiancée Emma inside his helmet before they left base, the same way he had done on every deployment since they got engaged, because it was the last thing he looked at before he went into a situation, and he wanted the last thing to be something worth coming back for. He had been in combat before, not like this. Mercer called for extraction. The voice on the other end was calm, with the specific flatness of a man reading from a script he has been handed. Alpha 7, the voice said, stand by. Then after a pause that felt much longer than it was. Alpha 7, situation has changed at the command level. Political considerations require we minimize American footprint in the Eastern District. You are ordered to hold position. Extraction is postponed, pending resolution of the diplomatic situation. Mercer listened to this. He understood every word. He understood it the way a man understands something that he has been told cannot happen and is watching happen anyway. He asked again. The voice on the other end told him the order stood. Then faintly through the static of the open channel, the sound of rotors. Growing, then diminishing. The extraction aircraft climbing and banking and receding into the cold December sky, their navigation lights blinking smaller and smaller, and then gone. 12 men. No support, no exit. In a kill zone that had been designed specifically for them by someone who had known they were coming. Mercer closed his eyes for 1 second. Then he gave his men orders in the steady, flat voice that command requires, even when command has been abandoned, and his men listened and moved and trusted him, the way soldiers trust leaders who have never yet given them a reason not to. 8,000 miles away in a command center lit by fluorescent lights and the glow of multiple monitor screens, Colonel Conrad Reeves stood with his hands behind his back and watched a thermal feed of 12 men fighting for their lives in a street he had helped send them into. He had ordered the extraction birds to abort. He had received the directive from above him, from a level he did not have the standing to override, and he had passed it down. He had done his job correctly. He had followed orders in the precise way that 30 years of military service had trained him to follow them. He was watching the consequences of that on screen 6. The communication officer said something about the diplomatic situation being resolved once American presence in the Eastern District was withdrawn. Reeves understood what that phrase meant. American presence. In a context where there were 12 American soldiers in that district, surrounded, abandoned, with an enemy force massing for a final push. He had done the math. It was not a complicated calculation. Then his intelligence officer pointed at screen 12 and said there was a thermal signature on the rooftop of the northeast corner building that had not been there 30 minutes ago. Single individual, long rifle, stationary. No friendly forces had been authorized for that position. Reeves looked at the signature for a long moment. The posture was wrong for enemy. The position was wrong for any attack on the men below. The sightlines told the story clearly if you knew how to read them. This was someone who had positioned themselves at the optimal overwatch point for the engagement at the exact range and angle that provided maximum coverage of Alpha 7's position. He had the intelligence officer pull the ID. Kate Harlow, specialist, 28 years old, confined to quarters, court-martial pending. He read the name once, then he read it again. He said her last name quietly to himself, in the way that a man says a name he recognizes from a context he has not thought about in years. Harlow. He had last heard that name in Kunar province in 2007 on a radio net that was going sideways in the particular way that ambushes in narrow valleys go sideways fast and loud and without clean solutions. He had been a major then running a parallel element 2 kilometers from the contact. He had listened to David Harlow's voice on that net for 12 minutes steady and precise and giving corrections and directions until the voice stopped and the net went quiet, and when the after action came in, the citation described what Harlow had done in the careful formal language that military records use when plain language is not adequate. He looked at the thermal signature on screen 12. One person, one rifle. A cold rooftop, no authorization, no support, no one who knew they were there. He turned to his communications officer and told him in clear, unambiguous terms that the position on grid reference 12 was not to be engaged under any circumstances. He did not explain why. He did not need to. Then he stood and watched screen 6 and screen 12 simultaneously, and he began to calculate how long it would take to reach the Secretary of Defense on Christmas Eve and whether 20 minutes was enough time to save 12 men who had been told that the people responsible for their lives had decided they were acceptable losses. On the rooftop, Kate Harlow did not know any of this. She knew what she could see through the scope. She knew the temperature of the air and the direction and speed of the wind and the drop table for .338 Lapua at 640 meters in current conditions. She knew the positions of 43 fighters below her, and she had ranked them by threat, and she had worked out the sequence, and she had run through it 17 times in her mind until the sequence was as solid and certain as any piece of information she had ever held. She knew that her left hand was losing sensation. She knew that her mother had called 3 times now. The third call had come at 23:40, and she had watched the screen light up in her peripheral vision and had not moved and had not looked away from the scope. She knew what her father had told her on the porch in September 2007. Only when there is no other choice you can live with. She looked through the scope at Brennan Cole checking his last magazine, at Clifford Brooks with blood on his shoulder still covering his sector, at Garrett Mercer moving along the line of his men in the darkness, checking each one, making sure each one was still in the fight, doing the things that leaders do when everything else has been taken away from them. She thought about the promise she had made, not the one to her mother. That promise was already broken by the simple fact of being on this rooftop. She had known that when she climbed the stairs. The other promise, the one made to a man who had stood in the open so that other men could run. She heard his voice the way she sometimes heard it, not as memory exactly, but as the particular internal clarity that comes when a decision resolves itself into something simple and plain, and not requiring further analysis. Only when there is no other choice you can live with. She reached up and removed the earpiece. The voice coming through it, giving orders she had already decided not to follow, cut off in the middle of a sentence. She checked her watch. 2,359 hours, 1 minute until Christmas. She settled her breathing. 4 counts in, hold, 8 out. Her heart rate dropped to the number it reached on the range on good days when everything was aligned. 50 beats per minute, 48. The world contracted to the scope and the rifle and the sequence she had built and rebuilt 17 times in the 4 hours she had been on this rooftop. Below her, the enemy commander raised his hand. Her crosshairs found him first. The first shot broke the silence at exactly midnight. No bells, no celebration. The suppressor reduced the report to something barely distinguishable from the wind moving through the broken buildings, a sound like a heavy door closing in a room far away, absorbed immediately by the cold and the dark, and the ambient noise of a firefight that had been running for 40 minutes. The enemy commander was raising his hand to signal the final push when the round found him. He dropped without completing the gesture. His body folded at the knees and then the waist, and then he was on the ground, and the hand came down with him, and the signal he had been about to give was never given. Kate was already on target too. The RPG operator on the western roofline was turning toward the sound, confused, processing the sudden absence of the man who had been standing 10 feet to his left a moment before. Kate did not give him time to complete the turn. 610 meters. Wind from the east at 2 knots. The adjustment was minimal. She made it without conscious thought, the way a pianist makes adjustments between notes, the body executing what the mind has already solved. The second shot, the RPG operator went down. The weapon dropped from his hands and clattered against the parapet and did not fire. 2 shots. 7.3 seconds elapsed. The enemy sniper on the northern rooftop had been scanning for her since the first shot. She could see him through the scope, a professional, working his own equipment, sweeping methodically, knowing from the angle of the first impact and the absence of sound that whoever had fired was somewhere in the northeastern quadrant, elevated, suppressed. He was good. He was narrowing the search pattern, with the efficiency of someone who had done counter-sniper work before. Kate waited 3 seconds, 4, 5. She needed him to commit. She needed him to stop scanning and settle to choose a position and present himself while he was certain of his own concealment. He shifted left around a ventilation housing on his rooftop, seeking a better angle on the eastern buildings. His head cleared the housing by 4 inches, 700 meters. The ballistic drop at that range required a correction that most shooters spend years learning to make instinctively. She had spent 7 years making it with her father's rifle on the range in the Blue Ridge foothills, in the dark before anyone was watching, before there was anything to prove. Third shot. The enemy sniper's rifle fell. 14.1 seconds elapsed. The counter-sniper threat was gone, and she had not yet been located. Below her, the first disruption was spreading through the enemy force. 3 men down in 14 seconds with no visible shooter, no audible report that could be triangulated, no muzzle flash. The fighters nearest the commander were looking at his body and then at each other, and the choreography of a coordinated assault was beginning to come apart at the seams in the way that choreography does when the director is no longer present to hold it together. Kate did not pause to observe this. She was already on target 4. A fighter moving toward the SEAL position with 2 grenades held across his chest, advancing low and fast along a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the street. 590 meters. Moving target. She led him by 18 inches, compensated for his velocity, and fired. The grenades did not go where he had intended. The explosion behind enemy lines added a new layer of confusion to the growing disorder. 19.8 seconds. The machine gun position on the eastern approach had been the threat Mercer feared most. 2 men crew-served weapon set up to rake the SEAL defensive line at the moment the final push began. With the commander down and the signal undelivered, they had not yet initiated. They were looking for instruction from a chain of command that had just lost its top 3 links. 5th shot, the gunner. 6th shot, the loader. The machine gun went silent with its barrel still cold. 26.5 seconds elapsed. Kate reloaded in the dark with the practiced speed of someone who has run the same drill in freezing temperatures on a training range until the magazine change requires no light, no warmth, no thought. 12 rounds remaining. The second magazine seated cleanly. 63 seconds left. The enemy was beginning to organize around a secondary commander, a man moving quickly between positions, pointing at buildings, directing fire toward the northeastern rooftops. He had not located her exactly, but he was working toward it, and if he had another 30 seconds, he would have the fighters positioned to force her off the roof or pin her down. 7th shot, 635 meters. The secondary commander dropped mid-gesture, one arm still extended. 34.2 seconds elapsed. In the SEAL position, she could see Mercer's head come up. He had registered the pattern, men falling without the signature of direct fire from within the engagement. Leadership being removed with a precision that was not random. He turned and looked upward, scanning the elevated positions to the northeast, and even at this distance, and through thermal imaging, she could read the moment of comprehension in his posture. Someone was up there. Someone was working for them. She did not have time to acknowledge this. Targets 8 through 12 were consolidating on the eastern flank, 5 fighters moving into position to cut off the exit route she had been building toward. This was the part of the sequence that required speed over deliberation, the transition from methodical to rapid, the ability to maintain accuracy while increasing the rate of engagement beyond what felt comfortable. 4 counts in, hold. 8th shot, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. 5 targets, 5 rounds. The eastern flank ceased to exist as a tactical concern. 48.7 seconds elapsed. 6 rounds remaining, 41 seconds left. The battlefield below was no longer operating as a coordinated force. It was operating as a collection of frightened individuals who understood that something was killing their leadership and their key weapons systematically from a direction they had not located, with a consistency that suggested this was not luck. Frightened individuals with weapons were still dangerous. But frightened individuals without direction were not an assault force. They were a crowd. She worked through the remaining targets in the sequence she had built, eliminating the radio operator who was trying to call for reinforcement, opening the northeast corridor by removing the 2 fighters blocking it, discouraging pursuit by taking the man attempting to organize a follow-on force. Each shot placed where her father's range tape said to place it at distances he had marked with his own hand in a notation system she had memorized so completely it had long ago become her own. 76.9 seconds elapsed. 2 rounds remaining, 13 seconds. The last clear threat was a fighter on a far rooftop setting up a light machine gun to cover the corridor she had opened. 710 meters. The wind had picked up 2 knots in the last 30 seconds, A change she had tracked through the scope's reticle movement on the target, a change she adjusted for without stopping to calculate it, because calculation of this kind had stopped being a conscious process somewhere around the 3,000th repetition. 18th shot. The machine gun tipped over the parapet, fell 6 stories to the street below. 84.7 seconds elapsed. Kate kept the last round chambered. She swept the scope across the remaining positions. What she saw was not a force preparing to regroup. It was men seeking cover and distance. The body language of fighters who have absorbed more than their psychological architecture was built to handle and have made the individual calculation that survival requires movement away from the current situation. The northeast corridor was open. She watched Mercer signal his men, watched them form up with the smooth coherence of a unit that has trained together long enough to read signals without words. Watched Brennan Cole check his sector and move. Watched Clifford Brooks move with him, one hand pressed against his shoulder, still covering his angle. Watched Warren Tate bring up the rear with the same quiet, unhurried competence with which he did everything. 12 men entered the corridor and moved north. Kate stayed on the scope until the last of them cleared the final intersection. She swept the corridor twice more. No pursuit formed. She became aware of her left hand at approximately this point. Not the pain, the absence of sensation is its own kind of information, and the information it was providing was not good. She had been on the rooftop since 1923 hours. The temperature at the position was currently 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Her cold weather gloves had been removed when she took position because fine motor control with the rifle required direct contact with the grip and the trigger, and the gloves interfered with that contact. She had known this was a cost when she removed them. She had assessed it as acceptable at the time. She tried to flex the fingers of her left hand. The index finger and thumb responded partially. The middle and ring fingers did not respond in any way that felt like her fingers responding. The tissue on the upper joints had the waxy, pale appearance of frostbite in its more serious phase. What she was looking at was past the point where rewarm and recover was the expected outcome. She noted this. She filed it. She began to break down the MK-21 with her right hand, and whatever functional movement remained in her left, working slowly and methodically, removing the magazine, clearing the chamber, collapsing the components in the sequence her father had taught her on a workbench in the garage in Roanoke when she was 15 years old. The rifle went into its case. The case latched. She sat back against the parapet wall and looked at the sky above Virginia and listened to the sound of rotor blades approaching from the north, low and fast, and running dark, the sound of extraction birds that someone had sent back around after someone had decided that 12 lives were worth the political consequences of changing an order. Her phone was in her chest pocket. She took it out with her right hand. 3 missed calls from her mother, the last one at 0003 hours, 3 minutes into Christmas morning. She looked at the screen for a moment at her mother's name, at the contact photo, at the garden, and the dirt-covered hands. She called back. The phone rang twice before Margaret Harlow picked up in Roanoke. Kate said she was all right. Her mother did not ask where she had been, because Margaret Harlow had spent 30 years in the company of military people and understood that some questions were not questions that received useful answers. She asked if Kate was cold. Kate said yes. Margaret said she had kept dinner. Kate said that was good. They stayed on the line for almost a minute without either of them saying anything, and at the end of it, Kate said she would call again soon, and Margaret said all right, and the call ended. Kate put the phone away and sat with the empty rooftop and the cold and the sound of the extraction birds getting the 12 men out, and she did not move until she was certain all of them were clear. Then she stood up, picked up the rifle case with her right hand, and walked toward the stairwell door and did not look back. The surgeon at FOB Lincoln, who assessed her left hand on the morning of December 25th, was direct with her in the way that experienced military surgeons are direct. There was no confusion about what had happened and no ambiguity about what the repair would require. The tissue on the upper joints of the middle and ring fingers was not viable. There was a reasonable chance of retaining partial function below those joints with appropriate care. There was no scenario in which she was getting those knuckles back. She listened and nodded and asked how long the procedure would take. He told her. She said she understood. She asked whether she would retain sufficient function in the remaining finger structure to perform fine motor tasks. He said probably yes with time. She asked specifically about trigger control on a precision rifle. He paused for a moment before answering because the question told him everything about the person in the chair. Then he said that the trigger was controlled by the index finger of the right hand, and her right hand had not been on the rooftop that night. She nodded again. She said, "Let's proceed." The hand that came out of surgery was bandaged from the wrist to the tips of the remaining fingers, And it was a hand that would no longer hold a rifle exactly the way she had held it for 7 years. The grip pressure, the weight distribution, the muscle memory built across 10,000 training repetitions, with the Mk21 resting in the specific cradle of a specific left hand, would require rebuilding from a different geometry. She knew this without anyone telling her. This was the cost she had not been able to calculate in advance. She had calculated the career consequences before she climbed the stairs. She had calculated the legal consequences, the disciplinary consequences, the probability of prosecution. She had made her assessment, and she had accepted the price, and she had gone up anyway. She had not calculated this, not because she had failed to consider it, but because there are some prices that cannot be fully pre-processed that have to be paid and received in the moment of paying before they become fully real. She sat in the medical tent on Christmas morning with her bandaged hand resting on her thigh, and she processed it the way her father had taught her to process difficult things, which was quietly and completely and without asking the world to accommodate the difficulty. She had made her choice. The choice had cost something permanent. The 12 men on the extraction birds were going home to their families. She considered this for a long time. Then she returned to her quarters. The 12 men of Alpha 7 returned to FOB Lincoln at 0142 hours on December 25th. They came off the extraction birds in the order they had boarded, which was everyone else first, and Garrett Mercer last, because 20 years of command had made the habit of leaving last into something his body did without instruction. Colonel Vivian Mills was on the tarmac. She had been standing in the cold since she learned the birds were incoming, because the last information she had received before the situation changed was that Alpha 7 was non-recoverable, and she intended to be present when it turned out to be wrong. She told Mercer to get his men to medical. She told him there would be a debrief at 0330 hours. He nodded and moved his men and did not ask the question that was already forming in all 12 of their minds, because Mills had given him an order he could follow, and he was going to follow it. Warren Tate said nothing during the medical assessment, which was consistent with how he handled most things. He sat on the edge of a cot and let the medic work and answered questions when they were asked, and while this was happening, his attention was on the window that looked across the tarmac toward the administrative building. He was connecting the pattern of what he had seen from the kill zone to what he knew about the authorized forces on the board and the conclusion those two pieces of information produced when placed against each other. He did not share this conclusion aloud. He knew that Mercer had reached the same place because Mercer had been counting the shots from the moment the first target dropped, and Mercer was not a man who missed things. Preston Dalton sat on a separate cot and looked at his hands. The medic asked if he was all right, and he said yes. He was not visibly injured. He was experiencing something more interior, a reckoning that had been running since the moment the extraction birds banked away and command had confirmed the stand-down order, a reckoning that had continued through every shot from the rooftop and was still running now. He had read the intelligence package 3 times. He had told Mercer the intel was verified at 3 levels. He had told 12 men that the picture was clean. He looked at his hands for a while and did not say anything. The debrief began at 0330 hours and ended within 4 minutes. All 12 members of Alpha 7 refused to provide statements until Colonel Mills told them the identity of the Overwatch element. Mills told them the Overwatch element was classified pending legal review. Mercer said that was not acceptable. Clifford Brooks said something brief and pointed about what classified pending legal review could do with itself. Brennan Cole was 23 years old and had been awake for 22 hours and had come very close to dying on Christmas Eve and had not yet spoken to Emma, and what he said was not brief. Mills let them finish. She had commanded soldiers for 23 years. She understood the difference between insubordination and men who had been pushed to the precise boundary of what institutional patience can ask of a human being. She told them the name. She told them what Kate Harlow had done, how long she had been on the rooftop, and what the medical assessment had found when they brought her in. She told them about the court-martial scheduled for January 15th. The room was quiet for a long time after that. Then Mercer said that all 12 of them would be submitting formal testimony on Kate Harlow's behalf, and Mills said that was their legal right as witnesses, and she could not prevent them from exercising it. And the intelligence officer who was present tried to say something about classified operational parameters, and the look that 12 recently returned from near-death Navy SEALs gave him simultaneously was the kind of look that does not require supplementary language. The letters reached Kate on January 3rd. They were delivered by a young corporal in administration who was Brennan Cole's second cousin and who had decided that his loyalty to this particular chain of command was situational. He knocked on Kate's door at 0800 hours and handed her a manila envelope thick enough to require both hands and left quickly in the manner of someone who has done the right thing and is prepared to deal with the consequences later. There were 12 letters inside. Mercer's was first. He wrote with the directness of someone who had spent his career in an environment where indirect language was a tactical liability. He told her what her shooting had looked like from the kill zone in specific technical terms, because he suspected she would appreciate that more than sentiment. He told her what it had looked like from his position when the northeast corridor opened and stayed open, and what that had meant to him in the moment he understood that someone was clearing it intentionally. He told her they were all going to be at her hearing, whether she wanted them there or not. Clifford Brooks wrote about his 3 children. He named them. He described them in the specific, unsentimental way of a man who knows that the value of something is not diminished by stating it plainly. He told her that his youngest, who was 4 years old, had asked him on Christmas morning where he had been, and he had said he had been working, and she had accepted this with the complete trust that 4-year-olds extend to their fathers, and he had held on to her for a while before he could put her down. He said he did not have adequate language for what that moment had required from him. He said he thought she might understand anyway. Brennan Cole's letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph was about Emma. The second paragraph was about the wedding in June and the fact that she was now going to be there for it in whatever form that took, because it would not be happening otherwise. He underlined the word otherwise once and left it at that. Kate read all 12 letters in her quarters with her bandaged hand resting on the desk and the empty case of the MK-21 on the floor beside her chair. She read them twice through. She did not cry. She came close, which was something that had not happened to her in a professional context in a number of years, and she noted it as information about what 12 specific people had managed to locate inside her, and she did not push it away. On the same day that the letters arrived, Colonel Conrad Reeves submitted his after-action report through official channels. The document was 43 pages long and left nothing out. It named the individuals who had issued the stand-down order. It named the individuals who had pressured command to classify the mission's actual status. It described in specific and technically precise terms the sequence of decisions that had led 12 men into a kill zone and then attempted to leave them there. It included Reeves's own decision to order the extraction abort without mitigation or excuse, because he had made that decision and it was in the record and his name was on it, and he was not going to write a document about institutional failure that protected him from the accounting it described. He also noted in a section toward the end that the unauthorized sniper whose actions had changed the outcome of the engagement was Specialist Kate Harlow, and that her conduct during the engagement represented the most precise and effective individual action under fire he had personally observed in 30 years of service, and that the pending court-martial represented an institutional response that was in his professional assessment, an inversion of the values the institution existed to protect. He sent the document. He understood what sending it meant for his career. He sent it anyway. The preliminary hearing in Kate's case convened on January 8th. The presiding officer was Colonel Harlan Owens. Kate sat across from 3 officers in a room that smelled of old coffee and institutional fluorescence, and said very little because there was not much to say that the record did not already contain. The charges were clear and accurate. She had received direct orders and she had chosen not to follow them. This was the second time she had made this choice. The evidence was documentary audio and ballistic. There was no factual dispute worth having. The presiding officer asked her whether she understood the gravity of repeated willful insubordination. She said yes. He asked whether she acknowledged that saving lives did not constitute authorization for violating direct orders. She said she understood the legal position. He asked whether she had anything to say in mitigation. She looked at Owens for a moment. She had been in the same room as him before during the Blue Ridge proceedings, and she had noted then what she noted now, a particular quality of official neutrality that sat slightly too comfortably on a man conducting proceedings. He had a personal investment in concluding in a specific direction. She said she had made her choice, and she would make it again under the same circumstances, and she had nothing further to offer the board. The board recommended proceeding to full court-martial. Owens watched her leave the room with the expression of a man watching something proceed exactly as he had arranged. What Owens did not know at the time of the preliminary hearing was that the radio transcript from the night of December 24th had not been as completely contained as he had assumed. The communications log from Command Center that night was a layered document with multiple access points, and one of those access points had been used shortly before the log was flagged for classification review, and the person who had used it was not anyone that Owens would have anticipated. Preston Dalton had been doing his own accounting since the night of the extraction. He had pulled every document he had legitimate access to. He had talked to no one about what he was looking for. He had done the work with the same methodical precision he brought to mission planning, which meant he was thorough and he was patient, and he did not stop before the picture was complete. The picture, when it was complete, included a timestamp on the command communications log showing that at 012 hours on December 25th, a message had been received at the command center authorizing renewed extraction for Alpha 7. The extraction birds had not been contacted until 0023. 11 minutes between a Secretary of Defense's authorization and the transmission of that authorization to the pilots who were waiting for it. The extraction had not been delayed by communications protocols or technical difficulties. The log showed the message received opened and sitting in queue while 3 lower priority communications were processed ahead of it. The name attached to the command center queue management during that window was Colonel Harlan Owens. Dalton did not take this to his commanding officer. He did not file a report. He did not make a speech or hold a meeting or announce what he had found. He was a man who had told 12 people the intel was clean and had been wrong about that in a way that had nearly cost 12 lives. And he was doing the only kind of accounting that he knew how to do, which was quiet and thorough, and pointed at the truth regardless of where the truth led. On the evening of January 14th, the night before Kate's court-martial was scheduled to begin, Dalton went to Colonel Reeves's office. Reeves was going through the motions of an end-of-day administrative review for a career that was already effectively over. Dalton knocked on the open door. Reeves looked up. Dalton set a single document on the desk. He did not explain it. He did not contextualize it. He set it down and looked at Reeves for 1 second, and Reeves looked back, and both of them understood what was sitting on the desk. Dalton turned and walked out. Reeves picked up the document. He read the timestamps. He sat back in his chair and held the paper and looked at the wall for a long time, and then he looked at the phone, and then he made a decision about what the next morning was going to require from him, which was more than he had already given, and which he was going to give anyway. In her quarters, Kate Harlow sat in the chair beside the empty rifle case and read Mercer's letter one more time. She had written back to all 12 of them 2 days earlier, telling them in direct terms not to sacrifice their careers for her hearing. She had meant every word. She had also known writing it that they were not going to listen because they were Navy SEALs, and she had saved their lives in the institution of telling Navy SEALs what to do, though under those circumstances had a notoriously poor track record. The court-martial was in 12 hours. She turned off the light. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling and thought about her father's handwriting on the range tape, each correction marked in the steady hand of someone who trusted the numbers because he had earned them. And she listened to the building settle in the Virginia winter, and after a while she slept. The court-martial convened at 0900 hours on January 15, 2015. The room was a standard military judicial space at FOB Lincoln functional and without character, designed to communicate that what happened inside it was procedural and not personal. 3 officers on the panel, a JAG prosecutor who had reviewed the file and understood that his job in this proceeding was primarily clerical. A defense counsel who had done what defense counsels do when the facts are not in dispute, which is to construct the most viable framework around the facts and hope that the panel could be moved by context even when they could not be moved by evidence. Kate sat at the defense table in her uniform. Her left hand rested on the table with the bandaging visible at the cuff. She did not attempt to conceal it or draw attention to it. It was part of the record documented in the medical report entered as Exhibit 7, and she treated it the way she treated all factual elements, which was to acknowledge its presence and return her attention to what was actually happening. The prosecutor walked through the charges with the efficiency of a man reading a technical document. Direct order, December 24, 2014. Stand down and observe only. Acknowledgement of order documented in communications log. Subsequent engagement of enemy targets without authorization. 17 confirmed casualties attributable to the defendant's weapon. This was the second count of willful insubordination during active operations within a 60-day period. The facts were not disputed. The defense counsel presented the mitigation case with genuine conviction and limited material to work with. 12 lives saved, exceptional marksmanship record. Nearly 7 years of exemplary service. The medical evidence of what the defendant had endured during the engagement she had not been ordered to conduct. He called the nature of the orders themselves into question, not legally because legally they were valid orders, but morally suggesting that the panel consider the context in which a soldier makes the calculation to disobey. The panel considered this for 4 hours. All 12 members of Alpha 7 were present in the building, seated in a waiting room down the corridor in civilian clothes. They sat and were quiet mostly. Clifford Brooks read a book. Warren Tate looked at the wall. Brennan Cole checked his phone repeatedly for messages from Emma. Garrett Mercer sat with his hands on his knees and did not move. The verdict was delivered at 13:47 hours. Guilty on both counts. The sentence was 2 years confinement in a military correctional facility, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and a dishonorable discharge from the United States Army. The presiding officer read the sentence with the same procedural neutrality that characterized the entire proceeding. The institution was performing a function it was legally required to perform, and it was performing it correctly according to the law that governed it. Kate received it, standing. She did not change expression. She acknowledged the verdict with a nod that was not submission and not defiance, simply a woman confirming that she had heard and understood what had been said to her. Her defense counsel put a hand briefly on her arm, and she thanked him quietly for his work. She was escorted from the room. In the corridor she passed, within 20 feet of the waiting room where Alpha 7 was sitting. The door was partially open. Mercer saw her through the gap. Their eyes met for perhaps 2 seconds. He did not say anything because there was nothing that the situation permitted to be said through a partially open door in a courthouse corridor with escort present. She did not say anything either. She held his gaze for those 2 seconds, and then she continued down the corridor. It was the only communication that passed between them directly that day. The document that Colonel Conrad Reeves had submitted through official channels had been routed upward through the classification review process in the way that sensitive documents are routed slowly with each successive layer, adding a classification designation and a routing delay until it arrived at the desk of someone senior enough to decide what to do with it. The person at that desk made a decision consistent with institutional self-protection, which was to hold the document pending further review, meaning pending the conclusion of the Harlow court-martial, meaning pending the point at which the politically inconvenient elements could be addressed in a controlled environment. What that person had not accounted for was the second copy. Reeves had not submitted one copy of his after-action report. He had submitted one copy through official channels because that was his professional obligation, and he was going to fulfill it. He had also sent a second copy through a personal contact with whom he had served in an earlier posting to a journalist at the Washington Post who covered defense and intelligence matters and who had, over the course of a long career, built a reputation for handling sensitive material with the specific kind of care that meant protecting sources and publishing the truth. The journalist read the document over 2 days. She verified the key factual claims against the sources available to her. She contacted the DOD press office for comment and received a response that neither confirmed nor denied the specifics, while strongly suggesting that publication would be premature. She published on February 8, 2015. The story ran under a headline that described in plain language a defense contractor's role in the preparation of an intelligence operation that had resulted in 12 American Special Operations soldiers being deployed into a planned ambush, and the subsequent decision by senior military leadership to proceed with a court-martial of the soldier whose unauthorized intervention had prevented those 12 deaths. The story named Apex Defense Group. It named the $4 billion contract. It named the intelligence package and the specific personnel responsible for its verification and transmission. It included the timestamp evidence showing the 11-minute delay in transmission of the Secretary of Defense's authorization. It named Colonel Harlan Owens. It also named Kate Harlow and what she had done on a rooftop on Christmas Eve with 18 rounds and her father's rifle, and what the institution had done to her in response. The story ran on a Sunday morning. By Monday afternoon, 3 members of the Senate Armed Services Committee had issued public statements. By Tuesday, the House Armed Services Committee chairman had requested a classified briefing from the Secretary of Defense. By Wednesday, Apex Defense Group's stock had dropped 41%, and its government contracts were under formal review. By the end of the week, Colonel Harlan Owens had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation by the Army Inspector General that would, over the following months, expand into a criminal referral to the Department of Justice. The Senate Armed Services Committee convened hearings in March. The first session opened in the Russell Senate Office Building in Washington, partially public the opening statements and senior official testimony conducted in front of cameras, operational specifics handled in closed sessions that followed. Conrad Reeves testified on the second day. He was no longer on active duty. He sat before the committee in civilian clothes, a gray-haired man with the bearing of someone who has spent 30 years in a professional posture and cannot entirely leave it behind. And he answered every question with the same directness that had characterized his written report. A senator from Virginia asked him about the anonymous encrypted message that Kate Harlow's defense counsel had referenced in the court-martial proceedings. The message that had reached Kate before the mission, the one that had told her Alpha 7 would be abandoned that night. Reeves acknowledged it without hesitation. He had sent it, he told the committee. He had reviewed the intelligence package for the Alpha 7 mission 2 hours before its execution, and something in the structure had struck him as inconsistent with organically developed intelligence. He could not prove his suspicion at the time. He did not have the standing to cancel the mission on instinct. But he had served with David Harlow in Kunar province in 2007, and he knew that SFC, Harlow's daughter, was at FOB Lincoln, and he knew from her service record what she was capable of, and he had sent a message into the operational system that he hoped might reach someone who would understand what it meant. He had not known it was her credentials that still had access. He had not known she would act on the message because acting on it required a level of personal cost that he had not been certain anyone would accept voluntarily. He had sent it because it was the only action available to him that carried any reasonable probability of reaching someone who might do what needed to be done. A senator asked whether he thought that was an appropriate use of command authority. Reeves said no. He said it was not appropriate and it was not authorized, and he would do it again under the same circumstances. And he wanted the committee to understand that these two statements were not contradictory. He said that there are situations in which the appropriate action and the correct action are not the same thing, and that a system which cannot account for this distinction is a system that is already in the process of failing the people it exists to protect. The hearing room was quiet for a moment after he said this. Garrett Mercer testified on the fourth day. He described what he had seen from the kill zone on Christmas Eve with the technical precision that the committee had been expecting from a SEAL commander and the human weight that several of its members had apparently not been. He described the extraction birds departing. He described the radio communications. He described the moment he understood that command had made its decision and what that decision meant for the 12 men in his charge. He described the first shot from the rooftop and the second, and the pattern that developed over the following 84 seconds, and what that pattern had done to the tactical situation. He was asked what he believed the appropriate recognition would be for Specialist Harlow's actions. He said that she had saved 12 lives at the cost of her career, her freedom and the permanent use of 2 joints in her left hand, and that the institution had thanked her for this by putting her in a military prison, and that he would leave the question of appropriate recognition to the members of the committee, but that he hoped they would weigh what he had just described carefully when they considered their answer. Brooks and Cole testified on the same afternoon. Brooks named his 3 children before the committee stated what they still had because of Kate Harlow and sat down. Cole was 23 years old and handled the Senate chamber the way he handled everything since Christmas Eve, which was by saying exactly what was true and nothing that wasn't. He told the committee about the photograph of Emma inside his helmet and what it had meant to see it on Christmas morning instead of as evidence at an incident reconstruction. The room was quiet when he finished. The hearings concluded in May. The full committee report was released in September, running to 412 pages. The unclassified sections described in detail the role of Apex Defense Group in the preparation of the Alpha 7 intelligence package, the failure of verification protocols within the chain of command, the decision to withdraw extraction support, and the 11-minute delay in transmission of the reauthorization order. Colonel Harlan Owens was the subject of a separate criminal referral to the Department of Justice. The investigation into his conduct and into the financial arrangements between his family trust and a subsidiary of Apex Defense Group, established 14 months before the Alpha 7 mission, continued through the autumn of 2015. On November 18, 2015, the President of the United States signed an executive grant of clemency for Specialist Kate Harlow, United States Army. The grant vacated the court-martial conviction on both counts, restored her to honorable discharge status, and reinstated all pay benefits and entitlements that had been forfeited at the time of sentencing. Kate was in a rented apartment in Alexandria, Virginia, when her former defense counsel called to tell her. She had been out of the correctional facility since September released, pending the outcome of the clemency review, living with a month-to-month lease and a part-time contract, doing security assessments for a firm that did work she was qualified for and paid her a rate that reflected the qualifications without requiring her to explain to anyone why she was no longer in the Army. She listened to her counsel describe the terms of the grant. She asked the relevant questions. She thanked him for his work over the previous 10 months. She ended the call and sat for a while in the kitchen of the apartment with her left hand resting on the table, looking at the healed surface of what was left of those 2 fingers. The Army had offered reinstatement as part of the clemency discussions. She had been asked several times through several different intermediaries whether she would consider returning to active service. The question was always framed carefully with an awareness of what it was asking. She had declined each time, not because she was angry, because she understood now what she was and what she was not, and the two things were no longer the same. She was suited for work where her judgment was the asset, where the person who hired her wanted her to assess a situation and make a call and trusted her to make it correctly, where she did not have to perform obedience to a chain of command that had proven in the most concrete terms available that obedience and correctness were not always the same thing. She called her mother in Roanoke and told her about the clemency. Margaret Harlow received this the way she received most things of significance, which was quietly and with a steadiness that had nothing to do with the absence of feeling and everything to do with the presence of discipline. She said she was glad. She said she wanted Kate to come home for Christmas. Kate said she would be there. Then Margaret asked about the rifle. Kate had been thinking about the rifle for several months. The MK-21 had been returned to her when she was released in September, processed back through property channels along with the rest of her personal effects, arriving in a transport case with a chain of custody form attached. She had opened the case when it arrived and looked at the weapon for a long time without touching it. She had made her decision about what to do with it before the clemency came through. The clemency had confirmed the decision rather than creating it. The National Infantry Museum at Fort Benning, Georgia houses the permanent record of the United States Army Infantry, the artifacts and documents and personal effects through which the institution preserves its memory of what it has asked of its people and what those people have given in return. It is the kind of place that understands the weight of objects that have been carried into combat because it has been the custodian of those objects long enough to know that a rifle is not only a rifle when it has been in the hands of the right person at the right moment. Kate contacted the museum's collections director in October. She described the weapon and its provenance. She described what she wanted the display to communicate, not in terms of her own actions, but in terms of the line of inheritance that the weapon represented. The collections director listened and asked careful questions and said that the museum would be honored. The formal transfer took place on December 12, 2015. Colonel Vivian Mills drove down from FOB Lincoln. She had submitted her own testimony during the Senate hearings and had accepted the career consequences of doing so with the matter-of-fact equanimity of someone who had been calculating that exchange for months and had arrived at peace with the arithmetic. She was still on active duty, still commanding FOB Lincoln, and had driven to Fort Benning on a Friday morning because there are things you show up for, and this was one of them. Kate met her in the museum's main gallery. They shook hands. Kate was in civilian clothes. Mills was in service uniform. The gap in formal status that this represented was real, and both of them were aware of it, and neither of them treated it as relevant to what they were doing. The display case had been prepared in the East Gallery adjacent to the section documenting Ranger operations in Afghanistan. The MK-21 was mounted on a padded backing inside a climate-controlled case, with the range tape still on the stock, David Harlow's handwriting still visible at the specific correction points he had marked for conditions he had encountered in a country he had not come back from. The placard read, M24SWS, serial number 7743-A, issued to Staff Sergeant First Class David Harlow, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, carried in service from 2001 to 2007, Kunar Province, Afghanistan, KIA October 3, 2007, subsequently held by Specialist Kate Harlow, United States Army, FOB Lincoln, Virginia, December 24, 2014. Father and daughter, same rifle, same mission. Kate read it once. She looked at the weapon inside the case for a long while, at her father's tape on the stock, at the correction marks in his handwriting, at the tool he had built his professional life around, and had asked her to use only when there was no other choice she could live with. She had kept that promise to the best of her understanding of what it required. Mills stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Mills put her hand on Kate's shoulder briefly 1 second, the pressure of acknowledgement and nothing more. And then her hand was gone, and they were standing side by side in front of the display case in the quiet of the museum gallery. That was the ceremony. No speech, no formation, no senior officer reading from a prepared statement about valor and sacrifice and the debt that institutions owe to individuals. A hand on a shoulder for 1 second in a room that understood by its nature the weight of what it held. They walked out of the gallery together. The museum's main entrance opened onto a wide plaza, and the December air in Georgia was cold without the specific severity of Virginia, a softer cold, the kind that carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere nearby. The sky was flat and pale with the particular winter light of the Deep South, which has its own character, neither harsh nor gentle, but simply present. Brennan Cole was standing at the bottom of the steps. He was in civilian clothes, his hands in his coat pockets, and beside him was a young woman who could only be Emma composed and watchful, with the expression of someone who has spent several months being engaged to a Navy SEAL, while a political and legal situation played out in the newspapers and on the floor of the Senate. She was visibly pregnant 7 months by Kate's quick assessment. Cole looked at Kate when she came through the doors. He had driven 9 hours from Virginia Beach because Mercer had sent a message to the team saying that December 12th was a date that mattered and leaving the rest to individual decision. Not an order, an invitation. Cole had told Emma about it the same day, and she had said, of course, and started looking at hotels in Columbus, Georgia, and the conversation had taken about 45 seconds. He looked at Kate the way men look at people they owe things to that cannot be settled by any conventional transaction. Then he nodded once, a single deliberate movement of the head that was not a gesture of greeting, but a gesture of accounting, an acknowledgement of a specific and permanent debt that they both understood could not be paid but could be recognized. Kate nodded back. Emma stepped forward and introduced herself. She was direct and warm, and she said what she had been thinking, which was that she knew what Kate had done, and she knew what it had cost, and she wanted Kate to know that she was standing here because of it. She said it plainly and without dramatic inflation, and then she waited to see how Kate would receive it. Kate said she was glad to meet her. She said she was glad Cole had made it home. Cole turned to Emma and said something in a low voice. She nodded, then looked at Kate directly. We already know what we're naming them, Emma said. She did not elaborate. Cole looked at the sky for a moment. Jake and Kate, he said. 2 of them. February. Kate looked at him. He held her gaze without adding anything to it because there was nothing to add. The names said everything that needed to be said about what the last year had meant and what the next years were going to carry forward into a world that had no idea they were coming. Kate looked at Emma, then back at Cole. She did not speak for a moment, and when she did, her voice was level and clear and carried the particular weight of someone who has spent a long time understanding what things cost and has just been shown what they were worth. She said that was a fine pair of names. They stood on the plaza for a while. Mills had her hands behind her back in the resting posture of someone at ease, in the formal military sense, which carries over into civilian life, whether you intend it to or not. She watched the interaction between Kate and Cole and Emma with the expression of someone witnessing a thing that has resolved itself correctly after a long and difficult process of getting there. The first snow began to fall as they were standing there. Not heavy, not accumulating the tentative early December kind of snow that appears in the South like a suggestion rather than a commitment. Individual, flakes large enough to see individually against the pale sky settling on Coat's shoulders and melting almost immediately on the warm concrete of the plaza. It had the quality that the first snow of the season always has of arriving from a direction that catches people slightly off guard, of making the familiar landscape briefly strange and briefly new. Kate put her right hand out and let a flake land on her palm and watched it dissolve. She was 29 years old. She had given the museum her father's rifle. She was going home to Roanoke for Christmas. Her left hand was healed as completely as it was going to heal the scar tissue along the trimmed fingers, smooth and pale and permanent. The grip she had spent 7 years building, now rebuilt differently, a new geometry that worked and was hers, and was not the same as what it had been. She had come to understand something about the promise she had made in September 2007, the one about using the rifle only when there was no other choice she could live with. She had understood it as a constraint for most of the years since, a line that marked the boundary of acceptable action. She understood it differently now, not as a limit, but as a definition. Her father had not been telling her to hold back. He had been telling her to hold out, to preserve the capacity for the moment when it was genuinely required to resist the smaller uses of power that diminish it, so that when the real moment arrived, she would know it, and she would be ready, and she would not hesitate. She had been ready. She had not hesitated. The snow continued to fall in small, uncommitted flurries over the plaza at Fort Benning, settling on the museum's stone walls and on the monument to the infantry soldiers who had left from this post and not returned, and on the 4 people standing at the bottom of the steps, and on the city beyond the post perimeter, where families were doing the ordinary December things that families do, putting up trees and wrapping packages and making the small domestic preparations for a holiday that exists to mark the continuation of life and the persistence of warmth inside the cold. Cole said something to Emma in a low voice, and she nodded, and they both looked at the sky and then at Kate, and there was no formal conclusion to the moment, because serious things do not conclude. They simply reach the point where the people involved have given what they have and received what they were going to receive, and life continues forward from there. Kate said goodbyes to Mills, to Cole, to Emma. She shook hands and said the things that are said at the end of a serious day by serious people. She walked to where her car was parked, and she did not look back, not because she was leaving anything behind, but because the direction that mattered now was forward, and she was already moving in it. The highway north ran through the Georgia flatlands and then up into the ridge country of the Carolinas and then into Virginia, where the mountains came in from the west and the air carried the specific cold of elevation. The kind of cold that has no sentiment in it, that simply is what it is, that asks nothing of the person moving through it, except that they continue moving. Kate drove with her right hand on the wheel and her left hand resting on her thigh, the healed fingers loose and still in the way they now rested when she was not asking anything of them. The radio was off. The road was quiet. She had 4 hours to Roanoke and no reason to hurry and no reason to stop. She thought about the photograph her father used to keep on the workbench in the garage taken at his first qualification course. A young man with a rifle and a posture that said he understood what he was holding and intended to be worthy of it. She had looked at that photograph 1,000 times growing up. She had understood it differently at each age. At 9, she had understood it as her father being strong. At 14, learning to shoot, she had understood it as her father being skilled. At 21, standing on the porch receiving the news, she had understood it as her father being gone. She understood it now as something else, as the particular expression of a person who has found the thing they are for and has committed to it fully and without reservation, accepting everything that commitment requires, the cost along with the purpose, because the alternative is to live without having been what you actually are. She had found that expression in herself somewhere over the past year. Not in the shooting, not in the 90 seconds on the rooftop, but in the long months afterward when the institution was doing what it was going to do, and she sat with the consequences without apology and without the collapse of everything she had built, because what she had built was not dependent on the institution's approval of it. The lights of the Virginia foothills came up in the distance as the highway climbed into familiar country. She had driven this road hundreds of times. She knew the exits by instinct, knew the places where the road curved away from the ridge and opened onto a long view west, knew the specific moment about 40 minutes out from Roanoke, where you could see the lights of the city in the valley below on a clear night. It was a clear night. She saw the lights from the ridge, and she held them for the few seconds that the angle allowed before the road curved back into the trees, and then they were gone, and she was in the last stretch, and the last stretch was familiar in a way that required nothing of her except to follow it. Margaret Harlow had left the porch light on. It was the thing she had always done for David through the years of deployment and late returns, and then for Kate when Kate began coming home from places that could not be named in conversation, and the light meant something that had never been stated because it did not need to be stated. It meant that the person inside the house had not stopped expecting you, that your return was still being waited for, that the waiting had not turned into something else. Kate pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment with the engine off, looking at the porch light and the warm rectangle of the front window and the garden along the front walk that her mother tended with the same quiet devotion she brought to everything that mattered to her. She picked up the MK-21 case from the backseat out of habit before she remembered that it was no longer there, that it was in a case in a museum in Georgia with a placard that would be read for years by people who had never known either of them. She sat with her empty hands for a moment. Then she got out of the car and walked up the front steps and knocked once before the door opened, because Margaret Harlow had been listening for the sound of tires in the driveway since shortly after dark, and the knock and the opening were one motion, and then Kate was inside, and the door was closed behind her, and the porch light was still on. The snow fell on Fort Benning, and on the highway north through the Carolinas, and on the Blue Ridge foothills, and on the city of Roanoke, where a house had its porch light burning, and somewhere in the East Gallery of the National Infantry Museum, in a climate-controlled case with a placard on its front, a rifle sat in the particular stillness of things that have been used for their true purpose and have been set down at last. The correction marks on the range tape were still legible in the low gallery light, each one placed in a steady hand at distances measured and verified, and trusted the handwriting of a man who had understood that precision was not about perfection, but about preparation, about doing the work before the moment arrived, so that when the moment came, you were already there. His daughter had understood this. She had understood it on a rooftop in the cold on Christmas Eve, and she had understood it in a military courtroom in January, and she had understood it in a prison facility through the months that followed, and she understood it now, coming home, her hands empty of the rifle and full of what the rifle had made possible. 18 rounds, 90 seconds, 12 men home for Christmas. Her father's handwriting on the range tape, her own corrections built on top of his 7 years of mornings on the range. The conversation they had continued past the point where one of them could still speak. The porch light in Roanoke. The snow coming down on everything.